June 7th, 2013. Richard Ramirez, better known as the Night Stalker, takes his final breath at San Quentin State Prison. Not by the electric chair, nor the gas chamber, nor even lethal injection. Instead, the man who brought terror to California's nights dies of natural causes: cancer. A quiet end to a man who thrived on chaos, blood, and fear. But who was Richard Ramirez? How did a boy from Texas become the embodiment of evil? And how did a trail of unimaginable crimes lead to one of the most infamous trials in American history? Tonight, we uncover the chilling story of Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Stay with us, because this story will drag you into the darkness, and you won't want to look away. Richard Ramirez's story does not begin in the shadows of Los Angeles crime scenes, but in the border town of El Paso, Texas, where he was born on February 29, 1960. His early years held no headlines, no flashing cameras, only the slow construction of a life destined for destruction. His father, Julian Ramirez, was a Mexican immigrant who had worked long hours on the railroad before settling into a life of instability. At home, Julian's temper was volcanic. He beat his children with belts, fists, and whatever else he could grab. Richard, the youngest of five, often sought escape from this environment by slipping out into the night, wandering through cemeteries and quiet streets. The dark comforted him. But it wasn't just violence in the home that shaped him, it was influence. His older cousin, Miguel, or Mike Ramirez, had returned from the Vietnam War carrying more than medals. He carried demons. Mike showed Richard photographs of women he claimed to have raped and killed overseas. These weren't just war stories, they were trophies of horror, graphic images of mutilation, of lives extinguished. Richard was only 12, but he stared at the photographs with wide eyes, absorbing every detail. One day, Richard witnessed the unthinkable. During a heated argument, Mike pulled out a gun and shot his wife in the face, right in front of Richard. Blood, chaos, death, all before his young eyes. This event shattered whatever innocence he had left. It was not just a traumatic moment, it was a turning point. Richard had seen murder up close, and instead of recoiling in fear, something inside him twisted. Violence no longer seemed distant, it felt real, it felt possible. By his teenage years, Richard was drifting further away from normalcy. He became obsessed with the macabre, horror movies, satanic symbols, violent fantasies. Drugs became his companions: marijuana, cocaine, LSD. He began breaking into homes not just for theft, but for the thrill of crossing forbidden boundaries. The act of invasion became intoxicating. But beneath the drugs and the petty crimes lay something deeper, a fascination with death, pain, and control. Richard started sleeping in cemeteries, not out of necessity, but desire. The silence of the graveyard was his refuge. While other teenagers dreamt of futures, Richard dreamt of power over life and death. His physical appearance also began to change. Tall and lanky with unkempt hair and decaying teeth, Richard stood out not for charm, but for his aura of unease. Friends and acquaintances described him as strange, unsettling, a presence that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. And yet women sometimes found his mysterious darkness intriguing, a pattern that would echo in his later life when admirers would send him love letters even behind prison walls. What makes Richard Ramirez's childhood chilling is not just the abuse, not just the violence he witnessed, but the way these elements fermented inside him. Many suffer trauma and abuse, yet do not become killers. But Richard absorbed it, nurtured it, and allowed it to grow. He was learning lessons no child should learn: that fear could be power, that violence could be thrilling, and that death was not an ending, but an opportunity to control.
By the late 1970s, Richard Ramirez was no longer just a troubled young man, he was becoming something else entirely. Evil was not simply knocking at the door, it had moved in. The boy from El Paso, who once sought refuge in shadows, was preparing to unleash those shadows on the world. And soon, the Night Stalker would emerge.
Los Angeles, in the early 1980s, was a city of sunshine, palm trees, and Hollywood dreams. But behind the bright lights, a different story was unfolding. One of fear, blood, and shadows. It was here that Richard Ramirez, the boy who grew up surrounded by violence and death, would step fully into his monstrous identity. The world would soon know him as the Night Stalker. At first, his crimes were scattered: burglaries, car thefts, and small-time offenses. But these were not just about money. For Ramirez, every break-in was practice. Every trespass gave him a taste of what it felt like to invade someone's most private space, to strip away their sense of safety. He wasn't just stealing possessions, he was stealing peace. Then, in 1984, the escalation began. On June 28th, 79-year-old Ginny Vincow was found brutally murdered in her Los Angeles apartment. She had been sexually assaulted, stabbed repeatedly, and her throat slashed so deeply she was nearly decapitated. The killer had entered through a window, prowling silently in the night. Police had little to go on. They didn't know it yet, but this was the beginning of Ramirez's reign of terror. From that moment on, Los Angeles would never sleep the same again. Ramirez struck without pattern. He had no specific victim profile: young, old, male, female, wealthy, poor. All were prey. That unpredictability made him more terrifying than most serial killers. No one knew where he would strike next. His method was as cruel as it was calculated. He would creep into homes late at night, often through unlocked doors or open windows. Once inside, the violence exploded. Ramirez raped women, sometimes in front of their children or husbands. He killed with guns, knives, or blunt force. He made victims beg for their lives, savoring their fear. In some cases, he forced his victims to swear to Satan, carving symbols of his dark devotion into the memory of his crimes. The newspapers began to call him the Night Stalker, a name that captured the terror spreading across Southern California. By 1985, the city was gripped with fear. Families nailed their windows shut, bought guard dogs, and kept weapons by their beds. The air was thick with paranoia. Everyone was asking the same question: who would be next? But Ramirez wasn't just killing, he was also sending a message. His fascination with Satanism set him apart from other killers. He left pentagrams drawn in blood at crime scenes, spoke of serving the devil, and sometimes demanded his victims swear to Satan. This wasn't just murder, it was ritual, a performance of evil meant to shock and terrify. The police, meanwhile, were scrambling. Dozens of detectives from different counties tried to connect the dots, but Ramirez's randomness made the case nearly impossible. Unlike most serial killers, he had no type. He struck in wealthy suburbs and poor neighborhoods alike. He targeted children and the elderly. His crimes crossed jurisdictions, which slowed coordination. For a time, Ramirez was a phantom. But phantoms leave traces. Ramirez's sloppiness soon became his weakness. He left shoe prints, fingerprints, and witnesses who had glimpsed his gaunt face, his rotten teeth, his unsettling gaze. Piece by piece, investigators were building a profile. Still, while police chased leads, Ramirez kept killing. By the summer of 1985, the death toll was rising, and the Night Stalker seemed unstoppable. The people of Los Angeles lived in dread. Windows closed tight, doors double-locked, lights left burning all night. Yet somehow, Ramirez still found a way in. The media amplified the terror. Headlines screamed of his satanic symbols, his brutality, his unpredictability. Television news described him as a monster lurking in the dark.
And in a twisted way, Ramirez reveled in the attention. He wasn't just killing, he was becoming infamous. The city had seen crime before, but never like this. Ramirez had transformed Los Angeles into a hunting ground, and no one felt safe. He was the shadow at the window, the creak on the stairs, the nightmare that lived in waking life. But for all his cruelty, for all his seeming invincibility, the walls were beginning to close in, and Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, would soon discover that his reign of terror had an expiration date.
By the summer of 1985, Los Angeles was no longer a city of dreams. It was a city of dread. Headlines screamed of a killer who slipped in and out of homes like a shadow. Mothers clutched their children closer. Fathers slept with baseball bats or shotguns within reach. The Night Stalker was everywhere and nowhere. But for Richard Ramirez, this fear wasn't collateral damage, it was the point. Terror was his weapon, and his victims became unwilling actors in his dark theater of cruelty. What made Ramirez so chilling was his unpredictability. Serial killers usually follow patterns: specific victims, specific weapons, even specific neighborhoods. Ramirez shattered those rules. He attacked men, women, and children. He killed the elderly, assaulted teenagers, and left entire families scarred for life. To him, no one was off limits. Consider his attack on Maria Hernandez in March 1985. She had just returned home when Ramirez confronted her in her garage. He shot her in the face, but miraculously, the bullet ricocheted off her keys, sparing her life. Staggered but alive, Maria fled. Ramirez pressed forward into the home and executed her roommate, Dale Okazaki, with a single shot to the head. For Ramirez, one near miss meant nothing. There was always another victim waiting. The very same night, he struck again. Veronica Yu, 30 years old, was pulled from her car and shot to death. 2 attacks within hours. It was clear the Night Stalker had no restraint. Ramirez seemed to grow bolder with each kill. He often forced his way into homes after midnight, choosing the dead hours when families slept soundly. He tortured, raped, and murdered, sometimes sparing one member of a family as if to leave behind a witness to his evil. Survivors recalled his cold stare, his foul breath, and above all, his chilling words, "Swear to Satan." In one case, he entered the home of William and Lily Doy. He bound William, shot him in the face, and then turned his attention to Lily, assaulting her while her husband lay dying nearby. In another, he tied up an 8-year-old boy, forcing him to watch as he brutalized his mother. These were not just murders. They were orchestrations of pain, designed to break people in the most intimate spaces of their lives. Each crime scene told the same story: forced entry, brutal violence, satanic symbols drawn on walls or etched into the minds of survivors. Forensic evidence revealed shoe prints from a size 11.5 Avius sneaker, a rare brand at the time. This clue would later become vital, but for now, it was just another piece in a terrifying puzzle. The victims' families, the survivors, and the community at large were living in constant panic. Neighborhood watches multiplied. People stayed awake through the night. Locksmiths saw their businesses boom. Gun sales spiked. And still, the Night Stalker prowled, as if mocking every effort to stop him. What unnerved the police most was the randomness. Ramirez wasn't targeting wealth or status. He wasn't bound by race, age, or gender. He could be in a wealthy Los Angeles suburb one night and a working-class neighborhood the next. His hunting ground stretched across counties, forcing detectives from different jurisdictions to scramble, often without sharing information fast enough. Meanwhile, Ramirez reveled in the chaos. He fed on the fear splashed across newspapers and television. Each headline made him stronger in his own mind. Each whispered warning in Los Angeles neighborhoods was music to his ears. He was not only killing people,
He was holding an entire city hostage. And yet, the cracks in his reign were forming. Witnesses survived, fingerprints were left behind, and the rare Avia shoe print kept showing up at scenes, a silent signature that would eventually betray him. Still, in 1985, none of that mattered yet. For the people of Los Angeles, the Night Stalker was more than a man. He was a nightmare incarnate. Parents tucked their children into bed with trembling hands. Couples locked their doors only to wake in the night to phantom noises. Even the bravest slept with lights on, because darkness belonged to him. Richard Ramirez had made the city his hunting ground. The question that haunted everyone was simple: when would the nightmare end?
By mid-1985, Los Angeles was a city on edge. Newspapers had given the faceless predator a name, the Night Stalker. But behind that nickname was Richard Ramirez, a man who seemed untouchable. He slipped through shadows, left terror in his wake, and mocked the police with every new victim. Detectives were desperate. Citizens were furious. Everyone wanted answers. The investigation began to focus on patterns, though Ramirez tried his best to leave none. Detectives collected fingerprints, fibers, and most importantly, shoe prints. At multiple crime scenes, investigators found the same clue: a rare Avia sneaker print, size 11.5. It was unusual enough to suggest it belonged to one man. Still, who was he? The police worked across counties, Los Angeles, San Francisco, and beyond. Each department pieced together fragments of evidence. Survivors provided chilling descriptions: tall, gaunt, with rotten teeth, a wild look in his eyes. A man who demanded victims swear to Satan. This wasn't just a killer, he was something darker. The turning point came after one of Ramirez's sloppiest mistakes. In August 1985, after a brutal attack, detectives recovered a clear fingerprint from a stolen car he had abandoned. Technology was limited, but it was enough. The print matched Richard Ramirez, a drifter already known to law enforcement for petty crimes. Suddenly, the Night Stalker had a name and a face. On August 30th, 1985, Ramirez's mugshot was released to the public. It appeared on the front page of newspapers across California. His days of anonymity were over. For the first time, the hunter had become the hunted. The very next day, Ramirez returned to Los Angeles, unaware that his photo was everywhere. He strolled into a convenience store to buy a soda, but as he glanced at a newspaper rack, he froze. Staring back at him was his own face, the Night Stalker, wanted for murder. Panic surged through him. He fled the store, but it was too late. Someone had recognized him. Word spread fast. On buses and sidewalks, whispers turned into shouts. "It's him! That's the Night Stalker!" Ramirez bolted, running through the streets, trying to steal a car to escape. But this time, the community fought back. Ordinary citizens, men, women, even teenagers, chased him down. Some armed themselves with pipes and tools. One man struck Ramirez in the head with a piece of metal. Another grabbed him by the collar. By the time police arrived, Ramirez was bloodied, battered, and pleading for protection. It was poetic justice. The very city he had terrorized for months became the force that ended his reign. The hunter was dragged down, not by SWAT teams or FBI agents, but by the people he had once held hostage with fear. When detectives finally had him in custody, Ramirez smirked. Shackled, disheveled, and injured, he seemed almost amused. For him, it wasn't over. It was only the beginning of a new stage, the trial. Behind the scenes, investigators scrambled to solidify their case. They connected him to over a dozen murders, countless assaults and burglaries that stretched across California. The Avia sneaker was entered as evidence, as were fingerprints, witness testimonies, and survivors' accounts. Every shred of evidence pointed to one man. But while the police celebrated his capture, the public still shivered. The question on everyone's mind was haunting. Could a man so ordinary-looking, just a thin figure with hollow cheeks and dark hair, really be the monster who had turned Los Angeles into a nightmare? Yes, and now that monster would face justice. Ramirez's capture wasn't just a victory for law enforcement. It was a turning point for the community. People who had lived in fear for months could finally sleep with their doors unlocked. Children could play outside again, and families that had been shattered by his violence could at least cling to the hope of justice. But as the trial loomed, no one knew just how strange and disturbing it would become. Ramirez wasn't finished shocking the world. He was about to turn the courtroom into his stage. The Night Stalker had been caught, but the world was about to see just how far his darkness reached. The capture of Richard Ramirez in August 1985 had ended one nightmare. But for the victims' families, the real battle was only beginning. The trial of the Night Stalker would drag on for years, testing the patience of the court, the resilience of survivors, and the strength of a city desperate for closure. From the moment Ramirez entered the courtroom, it was clear this would not be an ordinary trial. Thin, pale, with dark hair cascading over his forehead, he looked less like a monster and more like a rock star. He smiled at cameras, he winked at onlookers, and when his charges were read aloud, 13 murders, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults, and 14 burglaries, he seemed unfazed, almost amused. The media frenzy was overwhelming. Every day, journalists packed the courtroom. The public hung on every word. The Night Stalker had gone from a faceless shadow to the most infamous man in America, and Ramirez seemed to relish it. But the evidence against him was damning. Survivors took the stand, their voices trembling as they relived nights of terror. They pointed directly at Ramirez. The shoe print from the obvious sneaker was shown to the jury, matched to scenes of unspeakable violence. Fingerprints, stolen jewelry, ballistic tests, all tied him to the crimes. There was no escape. Still, Ramirez turned the proceedings into a spectacle. He carved a pentagram into his palm and flashed it to the jury, declaring, "Hail Satan." He mocked prosecutors, grinned at victims' families, and whispered obscenities under his breath. Some in the audience gasped, others shuddered, but all eyes remained fixed on him. The trial dragged on for nearly 4 years. Every delay, every outburst, only deepened the agony for families seeking justice. Yet the prosecution pressed forward, piece by piece, dismantling the facade Ramirez tried to maintain. Finally, in September 1989, the verdict was delivered. The jury found Richard Ramirez guilty on all counts. The courtroom fell silent as the judge read the sentence: death by gas chamber. It was the justice the city had demanded, though Ramirez himself seemed indifferent. He smirked, shrugged, and delivered his now infamous words: "Big deal. Death always went with the territory. See you in Disneyland." The Night Stalker was officially condemned to die. But California's death row is a place where executions move slowly. Ramirez was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would spend the next 2 decades. Behind bars, he remained an enigma. Fans, mostly women, sent him letters, money, and even marriage proposals. In 1996, he married a freelance writer who had become infatuated with him, a grim reminder of society's strange fascination with monsters. But life in prison was not glamorous. Isolated, aging, and plagued by illness, Ramirez's once menacing presence began to fade. His teeth rotted further, his body weakened, and the energy that once terrified Los Angeles dissolved into a shell of what he once was. Then, in June 2013,
Richard Ramirez's reign finally ended, not with the gas chamber, but with disease. He died of complications related to B-cell lymphoma at the age of 53. For many, it felt like a stolen justice. The families who had waited decades for his execution never saw it carried out. Instead, Ramirez slipped away quietly in a prison hospital bed. But even in death, his legacy lingered. The Night Stalker left scars not only on his victims and their families, but on the psyche of an entire city. He was proof that evil can wear the face of an ordinary man, that terror can live next door, and that darkness often hides behind a smile. Richard Ramirez wanted to be remembered as a servant of chaos, a disciple of Satan. Instead, history remembers him as something even more terrifying, a man who chose to embrace pure evil and who for a time held millions in the grip of fear. The Night Stalker was gone, but his shadow, that will never fade.
Richard Ramirez, the so-called Night Stalker, is gone, but his shadow still lingers in every whispered story, every sleepless night, and every reminder of how darkness can walk among us. His crimes remind us that evil does not always wear a mask. Sometimes it wears the face of a man passing you on the street. But his story is only one chapter in the chilling history of true crime, and there are many more stories waiting to be uncovered. Stories just as haunting, just as mysterious, and just as unforgettable. If this story gripped you, if it sparked that curiosity to know more about the darkest corners of human nature, don't let it end here. Hit the like button to support this work. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss the next chilling case. And most importantly, share your thoughts in the comments. Do you believe monsters like Ramirez are born or made? Your comments, your shares, your voice, they help bring these stories to light, and they help this channel reach others who crave the truth, no matter how dark it may be. This was the Devil in Disguise, Richard Ramirez. Until the next story, stay curious, stay cautious, and remember, evil often hides in plain sight.